When my mother saw the two bodies lying on the floor, the blood forming a dark pool spreading across the wooden floor of my room, something inside her broke in a way that could never be completely fixed. Hello, my darlings. This is Grandma Teresa, with my 78 years of life experience and a story that's been buried deep in my soul for decades. Today I've decided to open my heart to you all, because sometimes the hardest stories are exactly the ones that need to be told. I'm sitting here on my porch in Burlington, Vermont, looking at the green mountains that have always brought me such peace, ready to share my complete life journey with you. Oh, now let's go back to 1955, when I was just 8 years old and living in Lexington, Kentucky, in a simple but love-filled home. A corner house with a small front garden where my mother, Martha, grew her colorful dahlias that were the pride of the neighborhood. My father, Samuel, worked as an accountant at the only textile factory in town. He was a quiet man, a man of few words, who enjoyed reading the newspaper on the porch after dinner, with his small transistor radio beside him, broadcasting Cincinnati Reds games. We were a simple family, like so many others in those days. I was an only child, born after my mother lost 3 previous pregnancies. A miracle, as she always said when brushing my hair before school. We had enough to live with dignity. On summer evenings, the 3 of us would sit on the front steps to catch a cool breeze and chat with passing neighbors. On Sundays, we'd attend service at First Baptist Church and afterward have spaghetti with chicken, my father's favorite dish. It was a peaceful life without major upheavals. My father didn't earn much, but we never went without. Our house had 3 small bedrooms, a living room where the radio sat, our most prized possession, and a kitchen with a wood stove that filled the house with the smell of coffee and cornbread. The bathroom was outside, in the yard, next to the washtub where my mother laundered clothes while humming country tunes. I attended Lexington Elementary School, walking there and back every day, carrying my little vinyl satchel that my father gave me on my first day of school. I was a good student, especially in English and history. I loved reading the books that Mrs. Margaret lent me, adventure stories, tales of distant lands, of princesses and knights. When I grew up, I said, I wanted to be a teacher like her. My childhood was made of small joys. The cloth doll my mother sewed for my birthday, afternoons playing hide-and-seek with the neighborhood children, the smell of cornbread coming from the oven on Saturdays, the sweet taste of apple pie with cheese that we ate after Sunday lunch. It was on a Sunday that he first appeared. My paternal grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forrest. Until then, I barely knew him. I only knew he was military, lived in Washington, D.C., and my father rarely spoke of him. I had seen his photo once, in a small frame that my father kept in his desk drawer. Not in the photo frames in the living room, where we kept pictures of the people we loved. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were finishing Sunday lunch when we heard the strong knock at the door. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks, as if whoever was knocking wasn't asking, but demanding entry. My father rose from the table with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of surprise and fear. When he opened the door, there he was, a tall man with a rigid posture, short-cropped gray hair, a well-trimmed mustache, and blue eyes as cold as a winter sky. Samuel, he said, without smiling, without embracing, without any gesture of affection. I've come to see how you're living. My father turned pale, as if he'd seen a ghost. Father, what a surprise. Please come in. It was the first time I'd seen my father call someone sir in our own home. It wasn't just respect, it was fear. He entered without wiping his feet on the doormat, looking around with the expression of someone evaluating, judging. He wore an impeccable gray suit despite the heat of that day, and brought with him a strong smell of mentholated aftershave that filled the entire living room. So this is your family, he said, as if commenting on furniture, not people. He looked at my mother, then at me, without smiling, without showing any affection. I expected more, Samuel, a bigger house at least. My mother, always kind and welcoming, nervously stood up, smoothing her apron. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Augustus. Would you like some coffee? I just made an orange cake that— I didn't come for socializing, he cut her off. I came because it is my duty to verify how my son is raising my granddaughter. The family carries our name, Samuel. I hope you are educating this girl with discipline. At that moment, I noticed something hanging at his waist, partially covered by his jacket. A pistol in a black leather holster. Even as a child, I knew what it was. Even as a child, I felt a shiver run down my spine when he looked directly at me for the first time. "Come here, girl," he ordered. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. I looked at my father, who nodded slightly, and then I approached, my legs trembling. "What's your name?" "Teresa, sir," I answered, my voice almost a whisper. "Speak up, child. A forest doesn't whisper. A forest commands attention." "Teresa, sir," I repeated, louder this time, feeling my heart race. He examined me from head to toe, as if I were a soldier at inspection. At least she's well groomed. Is she learning to read and write properly? What grades does she get in school? Before I could answer, my father intervened. "Teresa is top of her class, father. Her teacher always praises her notebooks." "I asked her, Samuel, not you." He looked back at me. "Answer." "I'm a good student, sir. I really enjoy reading and—" "Reading what? Those silly fairy tales? Or something useful?" I fell silent, not knowing how to respond. He let out a sigh of disapproval and then turned to my father. "I'll be in town for a few days. The army has assigned me to inspect the local barracks. I'll return next weekend for dinner. I want to see how you're educating my granddaughter." It wasn't a request, it was a warning. And with that, he turned and left, leaving a heavy silence in the room. When the door closed, my mother released the breath she seemed to have been holding since he entered. My father collapsed into his chair, running his hand over his face. "Samuel, you didn't tell me your father was like that," my mother commented quietly, as if afraid he might hear through the walls. "He's always been like that, Martha. That's why I left home at 17 and never went back," my father replied, his voice tired. "I was hoping he'd forgotten we have a daughter." That night, I heard my parents talking in their bedroom, their voices muffled by the closed door. My mother seemed worried, my father resigned. "We can't simply prevent him from coming, Martha. He's an army colonel now. He has influence, knows important people. If I refuse, well, you don't know my father." He doesn't accept no for an answer. It was the beginning of a change in our house. The following Sunday, as promised, he returned for dinner. This time, he brought a present for me. An expensive porcelain doll with a velvet dress and patent leather shoes. It was the most beautiful doll I had ever seen, but I was too afraid of him to show genuine joy. "A girl must learn to be delicate like porcelain, but strong inside," he said as he handed me the doll. "Don't break it. If you break it, there won't be another." There was something between the lines of those words, a veiled threat that even a child could perceive. Dinner was tense. My mother had spent the entire day cooking a roast chicken with potatoes, her specialty. He ate in silence, occasionally criticizing the salt, the doneness of the meat, the simplicity of the dishes. Each word was like a small stab at my mother's pride, who smiled nervously and apologized. My father barely spoke throughout dinner, responding only when directly questioned. There was a transformation in him when his father was around. From a calm man respected in his community, he became almost an insecure boy, afraid of making mistakes. After dinner, my grandfather insisted on seeing my school notebooks. He flipped through each page with a critical expression, pointing out every small error, every poorly formed letter. "This handwriting is unacceptable. A forest has firm, determined handwriting. This looks like an animal's scribble." I swallowed my tears, determined not to show weakness before him. Somehow I instinctively knew that crying would only make things worse. He left around 9, promising, or threatening, to return the next weekend. When he left, it was as if a weight had been lifted from the house. We could breathe again. "Why is Grandpa so stern, Dad?" I asked when we were safe, alone. My father sighed deeply. "He believes that discipline and rigidity build character, sweetheart. That's how he was raised, and that's how he tried to raise me. You're afraid of him, aren't you?" My father was silent for a moment, then said something I never forgot. "Sometimes, Teresa, fear isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's just good sense." In the weeks that followed, a routine was established. Every weekend my grandfather would appear, sometimes for Sunday lunch, sometimes for Saturday dinner. Each visit was preceded by a complete cleaning of the house, with my mother obsessively checking if every corner was clean, if every piece of silverware shone, if the meal would be perfect. She desperately wanted his approval, perhaps out of love for my father, perhaps from an innate desire to please. But approval never came. There was always criticism, always something that could have been better. The house was too simple. The food was good, but not exceptional. I was polite, but could be more disciplined. Over time, he began to bring gifts for our home. An expensive china cabinet that completely clashed with the rest of our simple furniture. A new radio, larger and more powerful than the old one. A Persian rug for the living room. Each gift came with a comment about how our house needed refinement. My father accepted everything in silence, unable to refuse without provoking the old military man's anger. Each gift was a form of control, a way to remind us that he was in charge, even though he didn't live with us. Slowly, he began to take up more space in our lives. It was no longer just on weekends. Sometimes he would appear on a Wednesday night without warning, just to check on us. He criticized the simple dinner my mother prepared on weekdays, my father's clothes after a day's work, my toys scattered around my room. Our house no longer felt like ours. It was as if we were constantly expecting a military inspection, always tense, always alert. The carefree laughter of Sunday afternoons disappeared. Conversations at the table became formal, measured. Even when he wasn't physically present, his shadow loomed over us. On one occasion, he arrived earlier than expected on a Saturday and found my mother still tidying the house with a kerchief on her head and a dirty apron. The expression of disgust on his face was so deep that my mother began to apologize frantically. "I'm sorry, Mr. Augustus. I wasn't expecting you so early. A woman should always be presentable, Martha. Always. Regardless of the time or circumstance. My late wife would never be seen in such a state, even by the servants." It was the first time he mentioned my grandmother, who had died even before I was born. My father once told me that she died of sadness, which I didn't understand at the time. Years later, I understood that she probably suffered from what we now call depression, possibly aggravated by living with a man like my grandfather. As the months passed, I noticed changes in my grandfather's behavior. He began to bring a bottle of whiskey when he visited us. He would drink 1, 2, 3 glasses while talking, or rather monologuing about politics, about the state of the country, about how the military should take control to bring order to this mess. When he drank, his eyes became different. The cold blue became something more dangerous, more unpredictable. His voice got louder, his criticisms sharper, and his gaze began to follow me around the house in a way that made me want to hide. It was around this time that he began to insist on giving me private lessons. He said that public school wasn't enough, that I needed a more rigorous education. On Saturdays, after dinner, he would make me sit at the kitchen table with notebook and pencil, while he dictated historical facts, mathematical equations, grammar rules. Any mistake was punished with severe criticism, and occasionally with the ruler he began to bring along with his books. "Pain teaches, Teresa," he would say, as he struck my small hands with that piece of wood. "Pain is the best teacher there is." My parents watched helplessly. My mother cried silently in the bedroom after I went to sleep. My father drank more and more, perhaps trying to imitate his father, perhaps trying to forget what was happening under his own roof. Colonel Augustus Forrest's authority was absolute, unquestionable. No one dared challenge him. At home, when we were alone, my parents tried to compensate. My mother hugged me more, made my favorite sweets, told stories before bedtime. My father brought small gifts, a hair ribbon, a new book, a chocolate. It was as if they were desperately trying to counterbalance the darkness my grandfather brought into our lives. But his shadow grew. It grew so much that it began to slowly suffocate our family, like a poisonous plant that twines around a healthy tree until it sucks all its life. What we didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. What we couldn't imagine was that authoritarian and frightening presence in our lives was just the prelude to a storm that would forever destroy the simple and happy family we were before the arrival of Colonel Augustus Forrest. And that, my darlings, was how my peaceful childhood began to transform into a nightmare that would reach its peak on a warm night in March 1956, when I had just turned 9 years old. But we'll explore that further as we continue. I think only those who lived under the same roof as a high-ranking military officer in the 50s can truly understand what absolute authority means. My grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forrest, wasn't just a rigid man. He was a force of nature, a hurricane that devastated everything in its path, leaving only remnants of dignity and self-esteem. As the months passed and his visits became more frequent, I began to notice patterns in his behavior. He always arrived impeccably dressed, even on the hottest Kentucky days. His gray or navy blue suit never had a single wrinkle, his shoes always shone like mirrors. His gray hair, military cut, didn't dare have a strand out of place. And that pistol, always there, at his waist, partially covered by his jacket, but visible enough to be a constant reminder of his power. When he was still sober, in the first hours of his visits, he maintained an icy formality. He spoke little, observed much. His blue eyes registered every detail of our house, every gesture, every word. All would be ammunition for later criticism. It was like living under the sight of a sniper who was just waiting for the right moment to fire. "Samuel, this picture is crooked," he would say, pointing to the small landscape my mother had bought at the craft fair. "An organized home reflects an organized mind." Or, "Martha, this tablecloth has a small mend. I prefer not to see mends at the table." It demonstrates poverty of spirit. Each criticism was a small wound that accumulated in our family's heart. My father, who had once seemed so strong and confident to me, diminished in the colonel's presence. His shoulders curved slightly. His voice lowered a tone. His gaze frequently fixed on the floor. It was as if, in his father's presence, he reverted to being the frightened boy he once was. In early 1956, we discovered that my grandfather had retired from active army duties. He kept the title and rank but no longer had daily obligations at the barracks. To our distress, this meant he began to spend even more time in Lexington, staying at a hotel near our house, but practically living in our living room. It was during this time that I began to better know the two colonels, the one who arrived sober and the one who emerged after the whiskey bottle was opened. The first was cold, calculating, methodically cruel in his observations. The second was unpredictable, explosive, capable of throwing a glass against the wall because the ice wasn't in the exact shape he wanted. "A man who doesn't keep his house in order is no man at all, Samuel," he would say when he was on his third or fourth glass. His voice got louder, his southern accent more pronounced. "Your father should have taught you that." "Ah, but I am your father, aren't I? And what have you become? A mediocre accountant who can barely provide comfort to his family." My father would swallow hard, accepting the humiliation in silence. Sometimes he would try to respond, "Father, we have a dignified life. We're not rich, but dignified?" The colonel would interrupt with a dry laugh. "You call this dignity? This house that looks more like a shack? This second-rate job? This life of conformity?" Then, inevitably, he would look at me. "Is this what you want to teach your daughter, Samuel? To settle for crumbs? A Forrest deserves more. The blood of my blood deserves more." It was strange how he always talked about me as a Forrest, but rarely used my name. It was as if I were just an extension of the surname, a vessel for the lineage, not a real person with feelings and individuality. As he drank more, his eyes changed. The ice blue became something murkier, more disturbing, and his gaze began to follow me around the house in a way that made me feel exposed, vulnerable, as if my school uniform had suddenly become transparent. There were times when he would call me to sit beside him on the sofa, place his heavy hand on my shoulder, and examine me closely, so closely that I could smell the mixture of whiskey and aftershave. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he would say in a different voice, almost melancholic. "She was stubborn too, you know. Stubborn to the end." In these moments, my mother would always find an excuse to call me to the kitchen to ask for help with some task invented on the spot. She perceived something that, in my innocence, I didn't yet fully understand. One night, when I was already in bed, I heard my parents arguing in low voices in the kitchen. "I don't like the way he looks at her, Samuel," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something wrong, something sick." "He's my father, Martha," my father replied, his voice tired. "He would never do that. It's just his way, authoritarian, controlling. Don't you see how his eyes change when he drinks? How he insists on touching her, on being alone with her? Please, Samuel, we need to do something. And what do you suggest? That I confront an army colonel, that I accuse my own father of… I can't even say it. Then let's leave, my mother implored. Let's go to Chicago, to the West Coast, anywhere away from him. And live on what? My job is here, and do you think he wouldn't find us? He has contacts all over the country, Martha. There's nowhere to hide from men like my father. The conversation continued, but I fell asleep before hearing the rest. The next morning, I noticed that my mother had deep, dark circles, and my father seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. The situation worsened when my grandfather decided to move permanently to Lexington. He bought a large house in the upscale part of town, one of those old mansions with columns at the entrance and a well-kept garden tended by hired gardeners. But, despite having his own residence, he continued to appear at ours almost daily. He especially liked to appear at dinner time, without warning. A colonel should always conduct surprise inspections, he justified with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's how you discover the truth about your subordinates. And then he would install himself at the head of the table, the place that once belonged to my father, and dominate the meal with monologues about the moral decay of the country, about the need for a firm hand in government, about how the communists were infiltrating all institutions. That's why I never parted with my pistol, he would say, patting the bulge under his jacket. A man needs to always be ready to defend his country, his honor and his family, in that order. The weapon was a constant presence, almost as if it were an extension of his body. I had never seen it completely, only the outline under the fabric or the holster when he removed his jacket on very hot days. But I knew it was a Colt 45 because he mentioned with pride that it was the same weapon he used when we cleaned the country of those communists in 1935. Sometimes, when my father dared to disagree with some extreme political opinion, my grandfather would hit the table hard, making the silverware clink, and growl, "Be careful what you say, Samuel. Your job at the factory depends on the goodwill of people who respect me. It would be a shame if that respect diminished because of your misguided ideas." It was a veiled threat, but perfectly understandable. My father would immediately fall silent. The colonel's power extended far beyond the walls of our house. He knew judges, sheriffs, factory owners. One word from him could destroy my father's professional life in a matter of hours. Over time, my father began to drink as well. Not as much as my grandfather, but enough to numb his own humiliations. He would come home from work, eat dinner in silence, and then sit on the porch with a bottle of cheap bourbon, staring at nothing until my mother convinced him to come in and go to bed. Our house, once a haven of peace, transformed into an emotional minefield where each word, each gesture, could trigger an explosion. We learned to tread carefully, to measure each phrase, to anticipate the colonel's moods, to adapt in advance. My mother desperately tried to maintain some normalcy in our routine. She insisted that we eat dinner together when my grandfather wasn't around, that we talk about my day at school, that we maintain some of the traditions we had before, like the special cake on birthdays or the stories before bedtime. But it was like trying to light a candle in the middle of a hurricane. At school, my performance began to decline. I couldn't concentrate, spending classes drawing in the corners of my notebooks or looking out the window. Teacher Margaret noticed the change and called me after class one day. "What's happening, Teresa? You've always been one of my best students," she asked with genuine concern. I wanted to tell her everything, about the fear I felt of my grandfather, about how our house no longer felt like our home, about the strange looks he gave me when he was drunk. But the words got stuck in my throat. Besides, what could she do? Stand up to a respected and feared colonel across town? "I'm just tired, teacher," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "I've been studying a lot at home, too." It wasn't a complete lie. My grandfather insisted that I study extra hours every day under his strict supervision. Any mistake was reason for endless lectures about discipline and excellence. "A forest doesn't accept mediocrity," he repeated like a mantra. "A forest leads, doesn't follow." In March 1956, shortly after my 9th birthday, something happened that further changed the dynamics of our family. My father was called for a business trip to Louisville. He would need to be away for 3 days, visiting factory suppliers. I had never seen him so reluctant to make a business trip. He made up excuses, tried to postpone, suggested that another accountant go in his place. But the factory owner insisted. It had to be him, with his experience. The night before the trip, my father called me to talk in the backyard, away from my mother's ears. "Teresa, sweetheart, I need you to be very brave during these days I'll be away," he said, kneeling to be at my height. His eyes were red. From fatigue or contained tears, I can't say. "If Grandpa comes to visit, always stay close to your mother. Don't be alone with him at any time, understand?" I nodded, confused by the intensity of his request. "And if he does or says anything that makes you uncomfortable, anything at all, you run to Mrs. Judith's house next door. It can be day or night, it doesn't matter. She's already been told that you might need to stay there for some reason." "Dad, I'm scared," I confessed, my voice small. "Why would Grandpa do something that would make me uncomfortable?" He hesitated, as if carefully choosing his words. "Your grandfather is a complicated man, Teresa. The war changed him, and your grandmother's death made him even more bitter. Sometimes when he drinks, he confuses people, confuses the past with the present." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the seriousness in his gaze frightened me. "Promise you'll come back soon, Dad?" "I promise, my princess. Just 3 days. You can be brave for 3 days, can't you?" He smiled, but it was a sad, worried smile. That night, I again heard my parents talking in their bedroom. My mother was crying softly, and my father was consoling her with whispered words that I couldn't make out. There was a climate of tension in the air, like the heavy silence that precedes a violent storm. The next morning, my father left for Louisville. We said goodbye at the front door, and he hugged me harder and longer than usual. "Remember what we talked about?" he whispered in my ear, before getting into the taxi that would take him to the train station. I watched the car drive away, feeling a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. Beside me, my mother was squeezing a handkerchief between her fingers, her knuckles white from the force. Her eyes followed the taxi until it disappeared around the corner. "Let's go inside, Teresa," she finally said, her voice forcibly cheerful. "Let's make cornbread. What do you think? Your favorite." But the bread didn't turn out well that day. My mother got the measurements wrong, distracted as she was, and the dough didn't rise properly. It was a small detail, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but somehow it seemed like an omen of what was to come. We didn't know then, but those would be the last moments of relative peace we would have, because that same night, when the Lexington sky was covered with dark clouds announcing a summer storm, we heard the 3 sharp, authoritative knocks at the door. The colonel had arrived, and for the first time, my father wasn't home to serve as a shield between us and his contained fury. There are nights that mark our lives like permanent scars on the soul. Mine happened that March 1956, when the skies of Lexington poured down rain, and my father was too far away to protect us. When the 3 knocks sounded at the door, my mother froze in the middle of the kitchen. We were finishing washing the dinner dishes, a simple dinner of rice, beans, and a fried egg for each of us. We saved money on days when my father traveled. The sound of rain against the clay tiles almost drowned out the knocks, but we both immediately recognized that pattern. 3 dry, authoritative, unmistakable knocks. "Go to your room, Teresa," my mother whispered, quickly drying her hands on her apron. "Go and stay there." I obeyed without question, running down the hallway to my small room at the back of the house. I closed the door, but left a crack to try to hear what was happening in the living room. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Augustus," I heard my mother's voice, trying to sound calm. "What a surprise! Samuel isn't here. He went to Louisville on business." "I know very well where my son is, Martha," my grandfather's voice replied, slurred and louder than normal. "He was already drunk," I realized with a shiver. "I didn't come to talk to him. I came to see my granddaughter." "Teresa is already asleep," my mother replied quickly. "She has school early tomorrow, you know how it is." "Don't lie to me." His voice rose dangerously. I heard a thud, probably his leather briefcase being thrown onto the table. "I know she's awake. It's only 8 o'clock. No child sleeps at 8 o'clock." There was a moment of tense silence, and then I heard his heavy footsteps crossing the living room toward the hallway. I jumped into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin, pretending to sleep. My heart was beating so fast, I feared he might hear it. The door to my room opened with a creak. Through a slit in my eyes, I saw my grandfather's large silhouette filling the doorframe, outlined against the hallway light. He was swaying slightly, one hand braced against the door. "Teresa," he called, not in a whisper, as would be appropriate for someone supposedly sleeping, but in his normal voice, slightly slurred by drink. "I know you're awake. A soldier never deceives his superior." I remained motionless, breathing as regularly as I could, despite the growing panic. He entered the room, his heavy steps making the wooden floor creak. I smelled the strong odor of whiskey mixed with his usual aftershave. The mattress sank when he sat on the edge of my bed. "Your grandmother used to pretend to sleep too," he said, his voice now lower, almost nostalgic. "When she didn't want to talk to me, when she was disappointed in me." I felt his heavy hand rest on my hair, stroking it in a way that seemed gentle, but sent shivers of fear down my spine. I continued pretending to sleep, while silently praying for my mother to appear, for that moment to end. "You look more and more like her," he continued, his voice changing to something darker. "The same eyes, the same face shape. It's as if she had returned through you." His hand moved from my hair to my face, touching my cheek with a caress that had nothing grandfatherly about it. I did everything I could not to tremble, not to show that I was awake. "Augustus!" My mother's voice sounded from the door, tense but controlled. "Let her sleep. I prepared coffee for us in the kitchen." There was a moment of absolute tension, during which I thought he would yell at her, expel her. But then the weight on the bed eased as he stood up. "Coffee would be good," he replied, his voice returning to its usual authoritative tone. "But first, I want to show something to the girl. A present I brought." "You can show it tomorrow," my mother insisted, with a courage I had never seen in her before. "She needs to rest for school." "School can wait," he replied firmly. "This is more important. Teresa, I know you're awake. Get up now." I realized I had no choice. Slowly, I opened my eyes and sat up in bed, trying to appear sleepy. "Grandpa? Ah, you see, Martha? She wasn't even really sleeping." He smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold and now bloodshot from alcohol. "Come to the living room, Teresa. I have something for you." I looked at my mother, standing in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light of the hallway. She made a small affirmative gesture with her head, as if to say, "Go, don't contradict him." But her eyes were wide with fear. I got up and followed my grandfather to the living room, my mother right behind us. On the living room table, beside his leather briefcase, was a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a glass with remnants of amber liquid. He sat in the main armchair, my father's armchair, and picked up the briefcase. "I brought something that belonged to your grandmother," he said, opening the briefcase and removing a small package wrapped in tissue paper, something she wore on the day of our wedding. He opened the package with almost reverent care, revealing a delicate silver brooch with a small pearl in the center. It was beautiful, elegant in its simplicity. "This brooch has been in her family for generations," he explained, his thick fingers caressing the metal with surprising delicacy. "She wanted it to be passed to our daughter, but we never had one. Only Samuel, a son who doesn't even honor the family name." His voice had a bitter tone now. "I decided you should have it. You are the continuation of the lineage." He extended the brooch to me. I hesitated, looking at my mother, who nodded slightly. I took the object, feeling its surprising weight for something so small. "Thank you, Grandpa," I murmured. "Try it on," he ordered. "I want to see how it looks on you." I looked at the simple cotton pajamas I was wearing, not knowing exactly where to place such a formal brooch. "Here," he said, standing up and taking the brooch from my hand. He approached, leaning over me, and began to pin it to the collar of my pajamas. His face was so close that I felt the whiskey breath enveloping me. His hands, normally so steady, trembled slightly as they worked with the clasp. "You have the same skin as hers," he murmured, so low I could barely hear. "The same texture, the same smell." When he finally managed to pin the brooch, his hands didn't move away. Instead, one of them moved down my neck in a slow caress that made me stiffen with fear. "Augustus," my mother intervened, her voice tense. "The coffee is ready. Why don't we go to the kitchen?" He didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on mine, his hand still on my neck. There was something in his gaze that I had never seen before, a mixture of pain, anger, and something more disturbing that I couldn't name. "Yes, the coffee," he finally replied, moving away. But before turning, he picked up the whiskey bottle from the table and refilled his glass. "Teresa comes with us. I want to tell her stories about the grandmother she never knew." In the kitchen, I sat rigidly at the table while my mother served the coffee. For him only, the two of us didn't drink coffee at night. He ignored the cup and continued drinking directly from the whiskey glass, his eyes never leaving my face. "Your grandmother was beautiful," he began, his voice oscillating between nostalgia and bitterness. "Beautiful and stubborn. Too stubborn for her own good." He then began to tell stories about my grandmother Elizabeth, stories I had never heard before. How he met her at a ball at the military club, how she came from a traditional family that initially disapproved of the engagement, how she had a laugh that could light up an entire room. But as he drank more, the stories became darker. "She changed after Samuel was born," he said, emptying the glass and immediately serving himself more whiskey, completely ignoring the coffee that was cooling in front of him. "She became distant, refused my touches, cried in corners. The doctors called it postpartum melancholy, but I knew the truth." His hand hit the table hard, making the cup jump and spill coffee. "She didn't love me anymore. She preferred that whining child to me, her husband, the man who gave her everything." My mother placed a hand on my shoulder, as if ready to pull me away at any moment. I could feel her trembling through the thin fabric of my pajamas. "I think it's getting late, Augustus," she said with false calm. "Teresa really needs to sleep now." "No." He hit the table again, harder this time. "She needs to hear this. She needs to understand the blood that runs in her veins." He turned to me, his eyes now completely dominated by something I can only describe as madness. "Your grandmother abandoned me, Teresa. She took those pills on purpose, knowing what it would do. A final act of rebellion against me." "Augustus, please," my mother pleaded. "This is not conversation for a child." He completely ignored her, leaning towards me across the table. "But you won't abandon me, will you? You're different. I can see it in your eyes. You understand the importance of loyalty, of obedience." The rain increased outside, the sound of drops against the roof almost deafening. A lightning bolt illuminated the kitchen for an instant, followed by the rumble of thunder. I shuddered, both from the startle and from the growing fear I felt. "I'm afraid of the storm, Grandpa," I lied, seeking an excuse to leave. "Can I go to my room now?" His eyes narrowed, as if he could see through my lie. "Fear? A forest doesn't feel fear, Teresa. Fear is for the weak." He stood up abruptly, staggering a little, and came around the table to my side. He grabbed my arm forcefully, making me stand up from the chair. "I'll teach you not to be afraid, like I taught your father, though he seems to have forgotten the lesson." "Let her go." My mother placed herself between us, pushing him away from me. It was the first time I saw her confront him directly, and the surprise on his face quickly transformed into fury. "Don't interfere, Martha," he growled, pushing her aside with such force that she fell against the stove, knocking over a pan that was on it. The metallic sound echoed through the kitchen. I took advantage of the moment to run, trying to reach the back door that led to the yard. From there, I could get to Mrs. Judith's house, as my father had instructed. But I wasn't fast enough. In 2 large steps, he caught up to me, grabbing my arm with such force that I let out a cry of pain. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was almost a roar now. "Nobody runs from me, nobody!" He dragged me back down the hallway, ignoring my protests and my mother's pleas, who followed him trying to make him stop. When we reached my room, he threw me onto the bed with force, making me hit my head against the wall. "You need to learn," he said, his voice strangely calm now, which was even more frightening than his shouts. "You need to learn the price of disobedience." I watched in horror as he took his hand to his waist and removed the pistol from its holster. The black metal gleamed in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Augustus, for the love of God!" my mother screamed from the door, advancing to enter the room. "Stay where you are, Martha!" He pointed the gun in her direction, making her freeze at the threshold. "Or I swear I'll pull this trigger." She stopped, her face contorted with despair, but didn't back away. "What are you going to do? She's just a child, your granddaughter." "I'm going to do what I should have done with Elizabeth when she defied me," he replied, turning to point the gun in my direction again. "I'm going to teach a lesson that will never be forgotten." I was shaking uncontrollably now, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak or react. The pistol seemed enormous in his hands, the barrel a black hole that promised the end of everything. "Take off those pajamas," he ordered, his voice calm again, almost clinical. "I want to see what you're hiding, what you think you can deny me." "No," I managed to whisper, my voice trembling with terror. "Please, Grandpa, no." He advanced, grabbing the collar of my pajamas with his free hand and tearing it with a violent pull. The silver brooch he had just given me fell to the floor with a metallic clink. I tried to cover myself, backing against the wall, but he pressed the barrel of the pistol against my cheek. "Don't make me repeat myself," he growled, his eyes completely taken over by a darkness that had nothing human about it. "Take it off, now." With trembling hands, I began to unbutton what remained of my pajamas, tears blurring my vision. I could hear my mother's desperate sobs at the door, powerless against the gun that kept her away. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his eyes roaming my body with a disturbing expression. "You've come back to me, haven't you, through her? You've come back." He was so out of his mind, so lost in his own madness, that he no longer seemed to see me as his granddaughter, but as the wife he had lost years ago. The pistol trembled in his hand, but remained pointed at me, while his other hand began to unbuckle his belt. "Today you will obey me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Today you won't say no. You won't deny me what is mine by right." Time seemed to drag as he leaned over me, the smell of whiskey and sweat enveloping me like a toxic cloud. I closed my eyes, paralyzed by terror, unable even to scream. I felt his rough hand touching my exposed skin, causing shivers of disgust and fear. The cold pressure of the pistol barrel against my neck, like a silent promise of what would happen if I resisted. It was then that I heard a noise at the front door of the house, the unmistakable sound of keys, followed by the door opening. "Martha, Teresa, I'm home." My father's voice echoed through the house, like a direct answer to my silent prayers. My grandfather froze, his head turning toward the bedroom door, confusion momentarily replacing the lust in his eyes. "Samuel?" he murmured, as if he couldn't believe it. "Impossible. He's in Louisville. The meeting was canceled." My father's voice approached down the hallway. "The train came back early because of the store." He stopped abruptly at the door of the room, next to my mother. I saw the exact moment when his eyes registered the scene. Me, partially undressed, cowering against the wall. His father, leaning over me, the pistol in one hand and the other on my body. The room in disarray, the smell of whiskey permeating the air. For a moment, no one moved. Time seemed to freeze in that horrible tableau, eternalizing the instant when the last innocence of our family was shattered forever. Then, everything happened very quickly. My father lunged forward with a roar that didn't seem human, throwing himself against my grandfather with all the strength of his body. The two fell to the floor beside the bed, a confusion of arms and legs and shouts. "You monster!" my father shouted, punching the colonel's face repeatedly. Your own granddaughter. Your own granddaughter." I curled up against the wall, pulling the sheet to cover myself, while my mother ran to embrace me, trying to protect me with her body. But my eyes couldn't leave the brutal fight unfolding on the floor of my room. My grandfather, despite his age and drunkenness, was a strong man, trained in combat. He managed to push my father away with a powerful blow, and then, in a quick movement, pointed the pistol directly at his chest. "You've always been weak, Samuel," he said, his breathing labored, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "Weak and ungrateful, just like your mother." "No, father, no!" My father raised his hands, realizing too late the danger. "Think about what you're doing." "I'm protecting the family's honor," my grandfather replied, his finger already pressing the trigger. "Something you never understood." The sound of the shot was deafening in the small space of the room. I saw my father stagger backward, a red stain rapidly expanding on his white shirt, exactly at the height of his neck. He brought his hands to the wound, his eyes wide with shock, and then fell to his knees. "Samuel!" My mother's scream tore through the air as she lunged toward him, momentarily forgetting the danger of the weapon. My father tried to say something, but only a red bubbling came from his mouth. His eyes met mine one last time. Eyes full of pain, of despair, and worst of all, a silent plea for forgiveness for not having been able to protect me. Then he fell forward, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud, the blood rapidly forming a dark pool beneath him. My grandfather stood still, looking at his son's body with an expression of shock, as if only now realizing what he had done. The pistol was still smoking in his hand when he slowly turned to me, his eyes meeting mine. "Elizabeth," he murmured again, madness fully installed in his gaze. "See what you made me do. By the way, don't forget about our giveaway. Like the video, subscribe to Grandparents' Tales, and leave in the comments a little bit about yourselves. I love knowing where you're watching from and who are the people on the other side of the screen sharing these memories with me. There are moments that divide our life into before and after. For me, it was that frozen instant in time. My father lying on the floor in a pool of blood, my mother kneeling beside him sobbing, and my grandfather, that monster who carried the same blood that ran in my veins, looking at me with the still smoking pistol in his hand. "Elizabeth," he repeated, advancing a step in my direction. "See what you forced me to do." The world around me seemed to have slowed down. I could hear each drop of rain hitting the roof, the distant rumble of thunder, the wet, bubbling sound of my father's breathing as life left his body. Through the tears that blurred my vision, I saw my grandfather approaching, the gun now pointed at my mother, who was protecting my father's body with her own. "Get away from him, Martha," he ordered, his voice strangely calm. "This is between Elizabeth and me." My mother didn't move. Instead, she raised her tear-streaked face and stared at him with a hatred I had never seen in her gentle eyes. "You're insane," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury. "Completely insane. You just shot your own son." It was as if something snapped inside him. His eyes widened, momentarily clearing from the fog of madness that dominated them, and he looked at my father's body as if seeing it for the first time. "Samuel?" he murmured, confused. He lowered the gun slightly, his hand trembling. "No, it can't be." That moment of hesitation was all I needed. With an impulse born of the purest desperation, I leaped from the bed and grabbed the small knife I kept on the bedside table, the same knife I had used 2 days before to peel an apple before sleeping. It wasn't large, it wasn't as sharp as it should be, but it was the only weapon within my reach. I didn't think, I didn't plan. My body acted out of pure survival instinct. I threw myself at him with all the strength my 9 years could muster, aiming at the only place I could reach with my height, his neck. The knife sank into the flesh with surprising ease, as if his elderly body had just been waiting for that final moment. I felt the metal tear skin, muscle, vessels, a sensation I'll never forget, no matter how many years pass. His eyes met mine at the instant the blade penetrated, and I saw something that haunts me to this day: recognition. Not surprise, not anger, just a look of understanding, as if somehow he knew this would be his end. As if, on some level, he had desired it. "Elizabeth," was the last word that left his lips, in a sigh broken by the blood that was already beginning to gush. He staggered backward, the pistol falling from his hand with a metallic thud on the floor. His hands went to his neck, trying uselessly to contain the scarlet flow that pulsed between his fingers. He took 2 more stumbling steps and then fell to his knees, exactly as my father had fallen moments before. I stood still, the knife still in my hand, his blood flowing down my small fingers, down my arm, staining what remained of my torn pajamas. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as if my mind had completely disconnected from my body. It was then that I heard a sound, a weak moan, almost inaudible. I turned slowly and saw my mother bent over my father. His eyes, which I thought were closed forever, were half open, moving slightly. "He's alive!" my mother exclaimed, hope breaking in her voice. "Teresa, he's breathing!" Those words awakened me from the trance. I let the knife fall and ran to their side, kneeling in the blood that was already soaking the wooden floor. My father was as pale as wax. His lips had a frightening bluish tone, but his eyes, his gentle eyes that had always looked at me with so much love, were blinking, struggling to stay open. "We need to get him to the hospital," said my mother, trying to stanch the bleeding from his neck with a torn piece of the sheet. "Now, Teresa, how?" I asked, the reality of our situation falling on me like a crushing weight. We didn't have a telephone at home. The nearest neighbor with one was 2 blocks away. The ambulance would take too long to arrive, especially with that storm. "Mom, how are we going to—" A noise at the front door interrupted my sentence. Someone was knocking, calling our names. "Martha, Samuel, is everything okay in there?" I heard a noise like a gunshot. It was the voice of Mr. Roy, our neighbor from across the street, who worked as a taxi driver. My mother and I looked at each other for a second, the same idea crossing our minds. "Help me lift him," my mother ordered, her voice taking on a strength I had never heard before. "We'll take him to Mr. Roy." I don't know where we found the strength. Me, a 9-year-old girl, and my mother, a small woman who had never lifted anything heavier than a bag of rice. But somehow, between the two of us, we managed to lift my father. He moaned in pain when we moved him, more blood flowing from the wound in his neck, but he was alive and fighting to remain so. We carried him down the hallway, passing my grandfather's body lying motionless, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, a dark pool expanding beneath him. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All my attention, all my strength was focused on helping to save my father. When we opened the front door, the rain hit us like a wall of water. Mr. Roy was standing on the porch, protected by the small eave, his face transforming from concern to absolute horror at seeing the state we were in. "My God in heaven, what happened here?" he exclaimed, immediately helping to support my father's weight. "Hospital," was all my mother could say, her voice breaking. "Please, Roy. Hospital. Now." Without asking any more questions, he took my father in his arms, with a strength he didn't appear to have in his thin body, and carried him to his taxi, parked right in front of our house. The rain completely soaked us in the short journey to the vehicle. "And the Colonel?" asked Mr. Roy as we accommodated my father in the back seat of the taxi, my mother sliding in to sit with his head on her lap. "Dead," my mother replied, with no emotion in her voice. "We can't wait for the police. Samuel won't last." Mr. Roy looked at me, standing in the rain, still holding the taxi door open. My torn and bloodied pajamas stuck to my body, my soaked hair falling over my face. He must have perceived something in my gaze because he didn't ask any more questions. "Get in, girl," he said simply, starting the car's engine. "Let's save your father." The ride to St. Vincent Hospital was a blur of wet streets, headlights blurred by the rain, and the constant sound of the windshield wiper trying uselessly to cope with the deluge. In the back seat, my mother whispered words of encouragement to my father, begging him to hold on, not to leave us. "You're going to be okay, Samuel," she repeated like a mantra, pressing the blood-soaked cloth against the wound. "You have to be. We have a whole life ahead of us, remember? You promised to take me to see the ocean." My father didn't respond, his eyes now closed, but his chest continued to rise and fall in shallow, irregular breaths. I grabbed his cold hand and squeezed it with all my might, as if I could transfer my own life to him through that contact. When we arrived at the hospital, things happened very quickly. Doctors and nurses appeared running as soon as Mr. Roy began honking frantically at the emergency entrance. My father was placed on a stretcher and rushed inside, leaving my mother and me standing in the rain, covered in blood, trembling not just from cold, but from fear, from shock, from all the emotions we had repressed during that desperate escape. It was only then, when I saw the horrified looks of the people in the hospital reception, that I fully realized what had happened, what I had done. "Mom," I whispered, clinging to her wet skirt. "I killed Grandpa." She knelt in front of me, her eyes meeting mine, her hands holding my shoulders firmly. "Listen to me well, Teresa," she said, her voice low but intense. "You didn't kill anyone. You saved us. That man was going to kill us, was going to kill all of us. Understand? You did nothing wrong. I nodded, unable to speak, the tears finally coming in a torrent that rivaled the rain outside. She hugged me tight, our wet and bloody bodies merging into one as we cried. For my father fighting for his life in some operating room, for the horror we had just lived through, and perhaps, though neither of us would admit it, for the man who, despite everything, was my grandfather and her father-in-law, and whose body was cooling slowly on the floor of my room. The following hours were a confused nightmare of questions, statements, police officers, doctors. A kind nurse took me to a separate room, helped me remove my bloodied clothes, and gave me a warm bath. As the water carried away the blood, both my grandfather's and my father's, down the drain, I cried silently, wondering if I would ever feel clean again. They dressed me in a hospital gown too big for me and took me to a room where a tired-looking doctor examined the bruises that were beginning to form on my arms, where my grandfather had grabbed me. He asked questions that I couldn't answer, exchanged concerned looks with the nurse, and finally gave me a syrup that he said would help me rest. As the medicine took effect, I heard fragments of conversations from the other side of the door. Police officers speaking in grave tones. Words like self-defense, abuse, murder. My grandfather's name being mentioned with respect, despite what he had done. The colonel's power, even in death, still influencing how people viewed the situation. The last thing I remember from that night was being taken to the same room where my mother was waiting for news about my father. She was sitting in an uncomfortable chair, her pale face marked by tears, also wearing borrowed clothes from the hospital. "He's in surgery," she told me when I settled into the narrow bed. The bullet hit near the carotid artery but didn't strike it directly. The doctors they're optimistic. I held her hand, fighting against the sleep the medicine was causing. "Will everything be okay, Mom?" I asked, my voice sounding small and distant to my own ears. She hesitated only for a moment before answering, squeezing my hand back. "Yes, my darling. Somehow, everything will be okay." I don't know if I believed her at that moment, but I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. And with that thought, I let darkness envelop me, falling into a deep and dreamless sleep, a small mercy after the nightmare we had lived. I woke up hours later, with the weak morning sun coming through the cracks in the hospital curtain. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was, and then everything came back in a wave of memories so vivid they made me gasp. I sat up in bed, frantically searching for my mother. She was in the same place where I had last seen her, sleeping in an uncomfortable position in the chair, her head leaning against the wall. Her face, even in sleep, showed the marks of trauma and exhaustion. "Mom?" I called softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes opened instantly, as if she had never really slept, just rested in a constant state of alertness. "Teresa," she said, getting up and coming to my bed. "How are you feeling?" It was an impossible question to answer. How to describe the turmoil in my chest, the fear, the guilt, the confusion, all mixed in a knot that seemed impossible to untie. "Dad?" I asked instead of answering. A small smile, the first since the beginning of that nightmare, appeared on her face. "He came out of surgery a few hours ago. He's stable. The doctors say it was close, very close. The bullet passed less than half an inch from the main artery, but he's strong, Teresa. He'll survive." I felt the tears return, this time of relief. My father was alive. Despite everything, he was alive. And I hesitated, not knowing how to ask about my grandfather, about what I had done. My mother understood without my needing to complete the sentence. She sat on the edge of the bed and took my hands in hers. "Colonel Augustus Forrest died last night in our house," she said, with a calm and controlled voice, as if she had rehearsed those words. "There was an argument, he shot his son, and then had a fatal heart attack. That's what happened. That's what I told the police, and that's what you'll say too if they ask." I looked at her, confused. "But that's not what happened. I stabbed him. With the apple knife." She squeezed my hands harder. "Listen carefully, Teresa. Your grandfather was a powerful man, with powerful friends. If the complete truth comes out, these people could make our lives hell. They might even try to take you away from me. I cannot, will not, allow that. So we'll tell only part of the truth, the part that protects us." "Isn't that lying?" I asked, my voice small. Sometimes, to survive, we need to carefully choose which truths to tell, she replied, her eyes never leaving mine. What matters is that we're alive. Your father is alive, and we'll move forward, together. At that moment, at just 9 years old, I didn't fully understand what my mother was doing. I didn't realize how brave and strategic she was being, protecting not just me but our entire family from scandal and possible legal repercussions. I only understood that she was offering me a way out, a way to leave behind the horror of that night. And I accepted. I accepted the story of the heart attack, repeated it to the few police officers who came to question me, always with my mother by my side, always with her carefully chosen words guiding mine. The respect that the colonel commanded in life continued after his death. No one questioned too much the story of an elderly man with health problems having a heart attack after a moment of extreme tension. The shot that wounded my father was explained as an accident during a heated argument, something that my own father, when he finally woke up days later, corroborated with a nod, although he was too weak to speak. My grandfather's funeral was held with full military honors. A war hero being taken to his final resting place, the coffin covered with the national flag, gun salutes echoing in the cemetery. We stood by the grave, my mother and I, receiving condolences from men in uniform we had never seen before, from local politicians, from important figures who feared the dead colonel's power more than they cared about the truth of his life. I observed everything with a strange detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else, another family. How could they be honoring this man? How could they speak of him as an example, as a patriot, as a dedicated grandfather? It was on that day, standing beside that coffin, that I learned the harshest lesson of my life. The world is not fair. The powerful rewrite history as it suits them. And sometimes, to survive, you need to accept this injustice, swallow the truth like a bitter medicine, and move on. My father remained in the hospital for almost a month. The bullet had caused extensive damage, and although the doctors had managed to save his life, his left side was partially paralyzed. He would never again be able to work as an accountant, never again be the strong and capable man I had known. But he was alive. We were all alive. And slowly, day by day, we began to rebuild what the colonel had tried to destroy. We sold our house. None of us could live again in that place where so much blood had been spilled. With the money from the sale and a small pension that my father received, ironically thanks to my grandfather's influence in the army, we moved to a small town in upstate New York where no one knew us, where we could start anew. There, slowly, we learned to live with our scars. My father, with his new physical disability. My mother, with the nightmares that woke her screaming in the middle of the night. And me with the knowledge that I had taken a life, even if to save our own. At 9 years old, I lost not only my grandfather and my home, but also a part of my childhood that I could never recover. But I gained something too, the understanding that we are stronger than we imagine, that survival sometimes requires impossible decisions, and that love, true family love, can overcome even the deepest wounds. And it was this love that saved us in the end. It was this love that allowed us, eventually, to find moments of joy again. It was this love that, years later, gave me courage to form my own family, to trust that not all men are like my grandfather, that not all stories end in tragedy. Today, so many decades later, sitting on this porch in Burlington, with my grandchildren playing in the garden and my husband of 50 years napping in the chair beside me, I can look back and see the long road we've traveled since that terrible night. I can see how each choice, each sacrifice, each moment of pain, and also of healing brought us here. And if there's one lesson I would like to share with you who are listening, it is this: no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. No matter how deep the wounds, healing is possible. And no matter how impossible it seems to move forward, there is always a path, even if we have to open it with our own hands. My darlings, if this story touched your heart in any way, don't forget to like this video and subscribe.